Sometimes the strongest among us recognize the broken because they too have known what it means to be cast aside. In a world where might makes right, one giant warrior would prove that true strength lies not in the enemies you defeat, but in the lost souls you choose to protect. The mead hall thundered with celebration, but Sten Bearshoulder heard only the quiet tears of a maiden hiding behind ale barrels. Thyra had come to the feast in borrowed clothes, her family scattered, her home burned. This fearsome warrior could have walked past her weeping. Instead, he knelt down and asked her name. When he led her to the high table and declared she would eat beside him, the entire hall fell silent. No one dared protest the giant's command. What did this battle-hardened warrior see in one broken girl that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of Sten Bearshoulder's axe had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the years, a constant companion that had earned its name Grief-bringer through countless battles across the northern lands. The weapon's iron head bore the scars of 100 conflicts, its wooden handle worn smooth by calloused hands that had wielded it in service to 3 jarls. Tonight, as he sat at the high table with Thyra beside him, the axe rested against the wall behind them, a silent reminder of the violence that had shaped his path to this moment of unexpected tenderness. The mead hall of Jarl Ingmar stretched before them like a wooden cathedral, its massive oak beams blackened by decades of hearth, smoke, and celebration. Carved dragons and wolves adorned the support pillars, their fierce expressions watching over the assembled warriors like ancient guardians. The air hung thick with the aroma of roasted mutton, fresh-baked bread, and fermented honey, while the flickering light of oil lamps cast dancing shadows across weathered faces. Sten remembered his first night in this very hall, 30 winters past, when he had been no larger than the maiden now sitting quietly beside him. His own farmstead had burned that autumn not in a raid, but in an accident that claimed his parents and left him wandering the roads like a ghost. Jarl Ingmar's father, Gunnar the Bold, had found him stealing scraps from the kitchen refuse and made a choice that changed everything. Instead of punishment, the old Jarl offered purpose. A boy who fights for bread will fight twice as hard for honor, Gunnar had said, his gruff voice echoing in Sten's memory across the decades. But first, he must know what it means to belong. Those words had proven prophetic. Under Gunnar's guidance, Sten had grown from a scrawny orphan into a warrior whose reputation stretched across 3 kingdoms. His shoulders had broadened to match his name, his arms thick as shipmasts from years of swordwork and shield training. When raiders threatened their territory, it was Sten who led the charge. When rival jarls questioned Ingmar's authority, they found themselves facing the giant whose very presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of war. Yet, for all his fearsome reputation, Sten carried within him the memory of helplessness, the hollow ache of having nowhere to belong. Tonight, seeing Thyra's tear-stained face hidden behind the ale barrels, that old wound had opened fresh and raw. Thyra sat beside him now, with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to fine company. Her borrowed dress, a simple woolen garment in faded blue, hung loose on her slender frame, and she kept one hand clasped over a small tear in the fabric near her shoulder. Sten had noticed how she unconsciously covered the damage, as if hiding evidence of her reduced circumstances. The torn cloak she had worn to the feast lay folded in her lap, its frayed edges speaking of hard travel and harder times. "Tell me of your family," Sten said quietly, his deep voice barely audible over the general revelry. "If it brings you comfort to speak of them." Thyra's fingers tightened on her cloak before she answered. "My father was Olaf the smith. He made horseshoes and farming tools for the settlements along the Greywater River. My mother, Astrid, kept the finest herb garden in 3 valleys. Her voice carried the reverence of cherished memory. My younger brother Bjorn, he would have been 9 winters now. He loved to help father at the forge, though he was still too small to lift the hammer properly. Sten nodded, understanding the weight of past tense. The raid came at harvest time? Just before, she whispered. We had stored the grain, prepared for winter. Bjorn was so excited because father had promised to begin teaching him metalwork when the cold months came. A tear escaped, despite her efforts at composure. The Bloodwolf clan struck at dawn. Most of the men were in the fields, checking the final harvest. We heard the war cries, the screaming horses, but by the time we understood what was happening, she fell silent, and Sten did not press. Around them, the feast continued with the easy camaraderie of men who had faced death together and lived to tell about it. Harold Ironarm was regaling a table of younger warriors with an embellished tale of their recent border skirmish, while Eric the Wise sat stroking his grey beard and nodding along with tolerant amusement. The Jarl himself held court at the head table, settling disputes and hearing petitions with the patient wisdom that had kept their lands peaceful for 20 years. This was the world Sten knew, a brotherhood bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. Every man here had earned his place through courage and loyalty. The very idea that someone like Thyra, innocent, defenseless, without clan or protection, could be cast aside, struck at the foundation of everything he believed about honor and duty. "You said you saw your parents fall?" he asked gently. Thyra nodded, her composure wavering. Father tried to reach Mother when they set fire to the house. A spear took him down 10 paces from the door. Mother, she called for Bjorn to run, to hide in the grain storage. I was gathering eggs behind the chicken coop when I heard her scream. She paused, steadying herself with visible effort. I found her later, after the raiders had gone, but Bjorn I searched everywhere. His body was not among the dead. Hope and despair warred in her voice as she spoke that last sentence. Sten understood both emotions intimately. In his experience, missing often meant captured rather than killed, especially for children who might be sold as slaves or raised as thralls. It was a slim chance, but not impossible. You have been searching for him these 3 months? Every settlement, every trading post along the river routes. I sold Mother's jewelry to pay for passage on merchant boats, slept in barns and stable lofts. She gestured to her borrowed dress. When I heard of Jarl Ingmar's reputation for justice, I spent my last coin to reach this hall. I hoped, her voice broke slightly, I hoped he might know something, or perhaps send word to other Jarls to watch for a boy matching Bjorn's description. The simple dignity in her words humbled him. While he had grown comfortable in his position as the Jarl's champion, this young woman had been walking dangerous roads alone, driven by love for a brother who might already be beyond saving. Her courage shamed his complacency. "And what did the Jarl tell you?" Sten already suspected the answer. That too many children have been lost to raids for him to track them all. He was not unkind, but... She shrugged with forced acceptance. He has his own people to protect. I understand this. Sten glanced toward the head table, where Jarl Ingmar sat in conversation with his advisors. The older man's weathered face bore the lines of countless difficult decisions, the weight of leadership that demanded choosing between competing goods. Ingmar was not cruel, merely practical. Resources were limited, and a Jarl's first duty was to his sworn followers. But practicality had never sat well with Sten when it meant abandoning the helpless. "You came to the feast tonight, hoping for charity?" he asked. "I came hoping for information," Thyra corrected with quiet pride. If any of the warriors had seen or heard news of captured children, perhaps they would share it with someone who had lost a brother. "I did not expect to eat at the high table." Sten smiled at her gentle correction. Even in desperate circumstances, she maintained her dignity. "And yet here you sit." "Here I sit," she agreed, a hint of wonder in her voice. "Though I still do not understand why you chose to notice me. How could he explain what he had seen in her face, the exact expression he remembered from his own reflection in still water all those years ago? The look of someone whose world had been destroyed, but who refused to surrender hope. She reminded him not just of his younger self, but of the man Gunnar the Bold had seen potential in someone worth saving, worth believing in. Perhaps, he said carefully, because I recognized something familiar. Before Thyra could ask what he meant, a commotion at the far end of the hall drew their attention. A travel-stained messenger had entered, snow still clinging to his cloak, and was speaking urgently with the Jarl's guards. Sten watched as the man was escorted to the high table, noting the tension that suddenly gripped the room. Jarl Ingmar listened to the messenger's whispered report, his expression growing grave. The easy atmosphere of the feast began to shift as conversations died and heads turned toward the unfolding scene. When the Jarls stood to address the hall, every voice fell silent. "Friends," Ingmar's voice carried clearly through the sudden quiet, "word has come from the eastern settlements. The Bloodwolf clan has struck again, 3 farmsteads burned, their people scattered or worse." Angry murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors. But this time they made a mistake. Our new ally, Jarl Magnus of Ironhold, caught their raiding party on open ground and delivered them a sharp lesson. The wolves are wounded and running for their mountain strongholds. A cheer went up from the younger warriors, eager for any news of enemy defeats. But Sten noticed how Thyra had gone completely still beside him, her face pale as winter snow. Additionally, the Jarl continued, Magnus reports capturing several of their thralls in the battle, including children who appear to have been taken from various raids over the past seasons. They are being cared for, while attempts are made to reunite them with surviving family members. Thyra's hand found Sten's arm, her grip tight with desperate hope. He covered her trembling fingers with his own massive hand, offering what comfort he could while his mind raced with possibilities. The messenger departed to rest and refresh himself, and gradually the feast resumed its normal rhythm. But for Sten and Thyra, everything had changed in those few moments. The slim possibility that had sustained her through months of searching had suddenly become tangible. "I must go to Ironhold," she whispered urgently. "I must see if Bjorn is among the rescued children." Sten nodded slowly, already calculating distances and travel times. Jarl Magnus's territory lay 3 days, hard riding through mountain passes that would be treacherous in the current weather. It was no journey for an inexperienced traveller, especially alone. "Aye," he agreed. "We must go to Ironhold." Thyra's eyes widened at his casual inclusion of himself in her desperate mission. "You would, but surely you cannot leave your duties here." Sten looked around the warm hall, filled with his sword brothers, then back at the young woman whose courage had reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. Some duties transcended oaths to Jarls. Some bonds mattered more than comfort and security. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a man discovers that his greatest duty has been waiting for him all along." As the feast continued around them, Sten found himself thinking not of the battles he had won or the enemies he had defeated, but of a scared boy who had once hidden behind these very ale barrels, waiting for someone to notice his tears. Tonight he had become the man he had needed all those years ago. Tomorrow he would help Thyra become the sister her brother needed her to be. 3 days had passed since the feast, and Sten found himself watching the horizon with growing restlessness. He had spent the intervening time making quiet preparations, checking weapons, securing provisions, and carefully gathering intelligence about the mountain routes to Ironhold. Thyra had thrown herself into helping the hall's women with their daily tasks, her nervous energy finding outlet in kneading bread and mending clothing with meticulous precision. The morning sun cast long shadows across the practice yard when the merchant arrived. Olaf Trader, a weathered man whose pack mules bore the dust of countless roads, had been a familiar sight at Jarl Ingmar's hall for over a decade. His timing seemed providential until he began speaking of what he had witnessed during his journey from the eastern settlements. "Terrible business," Olaf muttered as he accepted a horn of ale from one of the serving women. Jarl Magnus means well, but he understands little about the Bloodwolf clan's true nature. Sten emerged from the armory, where he had been sharpening his sea axe, drawn by the merchant's grim tone. Several other warriors had gathered around the fire pit where Olaf warmed himself, their faces reflecting concern at his words. "What news from Ironhold?" Eric the Wise asked, settling his aging bones on a nearby bench. The merchant's expression darkened as he reached into his travelling pouch and withdrew a single black feather the kind ravens dropped when circling carrion. But this one had been deliberately bound with a thin strip of leather, marking it as a message rather than mere refuse. "Found this pinned to a tree not 2 miles from Magnus's stronghold," Olaf said, holding up the raven feather. Alongside it was carved a message in the old runic script. "The Bloodwolves have not retreated, they have regrouped." A chill ran through the assembled men that had nothing to do with the morning air. Sten stepped closer, his warrior's instincts suddenly alert. What did the message say? That every child taken from their raiding party would die unless Magnus returns what belongs to them, their weapons, their horses, and their fallen comrades, for proper burial. They gave him until the new moon to comply. Olaf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's 4 days hence." The implications struck Sten like a physical blow. If Bjorn was indeed among the rescued children at Ironhold, he was now a bargaining piece in a deadly game between jarls. Magnus faced an impossible choice: surrender the means of his enemy's future raids, or watch innocent children pay the price for his victory. "Magnus will not yield to threats," Eric observed grimly. "His pride would never allow it." "Nor should it," agreed Harold Ironarm, who had joined the circle around the fire. "To negotiate with the Bloodwolves is to invite greater attacks. They respect only strength." Sten found himself thinking not of military strategy, but of a 9-year-old boy who loved working at his father's forge. While these seasoned warriors debated honor and tactics, somewhere in the mountains a child might be counting down his final days. The sound of running feet interrupted his dark thoughts. Thyra burst from the main hall, her face flushed with exertion and barely controlled panic. She must have overheard enough of the conversation to understand its terrible significance. "The children," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "The rescued children, they are all in danger because of this?" Olaf nodded reluctantly. "I fear so, lass. The Bloodwolves are known for keeping their promises, especially the Dark Ones." Thyra's composure, which had held through months of searching and disappointment, finally cracked. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the full weight of cruel hope crashed over her. To discover that Bjorn might be alive, only to learn that he faced execution in a political standoff, was perhaps worse than believing him already dead. Sten moved instinctively to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. He could feel the tremors running through her slender frame, fear, rage, and desperate determination all warring within her. "There must be something we can do," she said, her voice breaking. "Some way to reach him before." "Before what?" Harold interrupted harshly. "Before you get yourself killed attempting what trained warriors would not dare. The Bloodwolf stronghold is a fortress carved into living rock. It has never been taken by siege, and any rescue attempt would be suicide." The brutal honesty of his words hit Thyra like a slap. She staggered slightly, and Sten's grip on her shoulder tightened protectively. His own mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. Harold spoke truth. A direct assault on the Bloodwolf stronghold would be futile. But perhaps other options existed. "What of the old paths?" he asked Eric quietly. "The routes your grandfather used when he raided their territory in his youth?" The elderly warrior stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. "Those passages have been forgotten for good reason, Sten. Half of them lead to dead ends or cliff faces. The others require knowledge that died with my grandfather's generation. But you know something of them?" Eric hesitated, glancing around at the assembled men. Enough to get a small party lost forever in the mountains, perhaps enough to get them killed more slowly than a direct attack would manage. Sten felt, rather than saw, Thyra's desperate attention focus on their conversation. He could practically hear her thoughts racing. If even the slimmest possibility existed, she would seize it, regardless of the cost. "I am going," she announced suddenly, her voice carrying newfound steel. "With or without help, I am going to find my brother. I will not abandon him to die because powerful men play games with innocent lives." "You will do no such thing," Harold snapped. "We have lost enough people to bloodwolf cruelty without adding your corpse to their count." Thyra's eyes flashed with anger that surprised everyone present. "You speak of my death as if it matters more than my brother's life. He is 9 years old. If these monsters kill him while I sit safely by this fire, I will never forgive myself, nor should I." The raw emotion in her declaration silenced the gathered warriors. Sten recognized the look on her face, the same expression he had worn when he decided to stop being a victim and start being something more. It was the moment when fear transformed into purpose. "The girl speaks truth," Eric said slowly, "but truth alone will not breach stone walls or overcome armed guards." "Then we must be smarter than stone walls and more cunning than guards," Sten replied, surprising himself with the firmness of his decision. "Thyra is right. We cannot abandon an innocent child to satisfy political considerations." Harold stared at him in disbelief. "You would defy the Jarl's wishes? Risk open conflict between allied leaders? Magnus has not asked for our aid in this matter." "Magnus does not know that Bjorn is Thyra's brother," Sten pointed out. "Nor does he understand what that boy means to someone who has already lost everything else. Sometimes the most important battles are fought for reasons that cannot be measured in gold or territory." The debate continued around the fire as morning stretched toward midday. Other warriors joined the discussion, some supporting Harold's caution, others drawn to the audacious possibility of outwitting their ancient enemies. But through it all, Sten found his attention returning to Thyra's face, the way she clutched the torn cloak that had become her last tangible link to her destroyed family. Finally, Jarl Ingmar himself approached the gathering. The older man's weathered features showed the strain of leadership as he listened to the arguments from all sides. When the voices finally died away, he spoke with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the weight of his words. "This matter falls outside our formal obligations," he said slowly. "Magnus has not requested assistance, and any action we take could be seen as interference in his affairs." He paused, meeting Sten's eyes directly. "However, I will not forbid a man from following his conscience, provided he does so without compromising this hall's honor." The carefully worded statement was as close to permission as Sten could expect. It also meant that any consequences would fall on his shoulders alone, exactly as it should be. "Then we leave tonight," he decided, ignoring Harold's muttered curse. "The new moon gives us 4 days to reach the stronghold and find a way inside before the deadline expires." Thyra's expression transformed from despair to blazing hope. "You mean it? You will truly help me save him?" Sten looked down at this young woman, whose courage had shamed his complacency and reminded him of truths he had nearly forgotten. "I mean it. Your brother will not face his fate alone." As the group dispersed to prepare for the desperate journey ahead, Eric the Wise approached Sten with a troubled expression. "You understand this is likely a path to death for both of you?" Sten nodded grimly. "Better to die attempting something worthy than to live knowing we abandoned a child to monsters." Eric studied his face for a long moment, then reached into his own traveling pouch and withdrew a piece of folded parchment, its edges yellowed with age. "Then perhaps you should have this," he said quietly. "My grandfather's map of the hidden paths. I had hoped never to see it used again, but—" He shrugged with resignation. "Some purposes are worth the risk." The raven feather message had changed everything. What began as a journey of hope had become a race against time, with a child's life hanging in the balance. But for the first time since finding Thyra weeping behind the ale barrels, Sten felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had made him a warrior. Tonight they would begin a quest that would test everything they believed about courage, family, and the true meaning of strength. As twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Sten found himself in the hall's quiet corner where Thyra had been carefully organizing her few possessions. She handled each item with reverence: a wooden comb that had belonged to her mother, a small eating knife with a bone handle, and tucked deepest in her traveling pouch, something that caught the lamplight with a silver gleam. "May I?" Sten asked softly, gesturing toward the object she held so carefully. Thyra hesitated, then opened her palm to reveal an intricately worked silver brooch, its surface decorated with intertwining vines and tiny flowers. Despite the tarnish of hard travel, the craftsmanship was exquisite, the work of a master silversmith. "It was my mother's," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "The only piece of her jewelry I managed to save before selling the rest. I have been saving it for—" She paused, swallowing hard. "For when I truly had nothing left to trade." The brooch represented more than mere silver and craftsmanship. It was her final connection to the woman who had raised her, the last bargaining chip between her and complete destitution. That she would risk it on this desperate mission spoke volumes about her love for Bjorn. "We will find another way to pay for what we need," Sten said gently. "Keep your mother's memory close." Thyra's grateful smile transformed her careworn features, reminding him that beneath the grime of hard travel lived a young woman who had once known comfort and safety. It strengthened his resolve to restore some measure of both to her life. Their preparations had continued throughout the afternoon with careful attention to detail. Sten had selected gear designed for stealth rather than battle: his smallest seax instead of his great sword, soft leather boots instead of iron-studded war gear, dark clothing that would blend with shadows and stone. If they were to succeed where armies would fail, it would be through cunning rather than force. Eric the Wise had spent hours sharing what he remembered of his grandfather's stories about the hidden mountain paths. The old warrior's memory proved remarkably sharp despite his years, and he drew rough sketches in the dirt beside the fire pit, marking landmarks and warning of particular dangers. "Here," he indicated a narrow line on the aged map. "The path splits around a deep ravine. The eastern route seems easier, but it leads to a sheer cliff face that cannot be climbed. The western path looks impossible, but there are handholds carved into the rock if you know where to look." Thyra leaned forward intently, memorizing every detail. Her quick intelligence impressed Sten. She asked precisely the right questions and seemed to grasp the tactical implications of each piece of information. "What about guards?" she inquired. "Surely they watch these approaches?" Eric nodded approvingly at her question. "The main garrison focuses on the obvious attack, routes the valley approach, and the eastern ridgeline. But the old paths were used primarily by smugglers and raiders who needed to avoid detection. If the Bloodwolves remember them at all, they likely consider them too dangerous to warrant heavy patrols." As evening deepened, other warriors began approaching them with quiet offers of assistance. Harold Ironarm, despite his earlier objections, pressed a small vial of wound salve into Sten's hands, along with gruff instructions about its use. Young Magnus the Swift contributed an extra water skin and a selection of dried meat wrapped in oiled cloth. Most significantly, Olaf Trader provided detailed information about the Bloodwolf stronghold's layout, gathered through years of reluctant but necessary commerce. "They keep prisoners in the lower levels," he explained, sketching in the dirt with a charred stick. "Natural caves that they have expanded and reinforced with iron bars. The children would be held separately from adult captives, easier to control and less likely to organize resistance." This intelligence proved invaluable for planning their approach. If Bjorn was indeed among the captives, they would need to reach the lower caves without alerting the garrison above. Eric's map suggested a possible route through abandoned mine shafts that connected to the stronghold's foundation, but it would require navigating in complete darkness through passages that might have collapsed or flooded in the decades since their last use. As the preparations continued, Sten noticed how Thyra had begun to transform. The frightened maiden who had wept behind the ale barrels was being replaced by someone harder, more focused. She practiced moving silently across the hall's wooden floors until she could cross from one end to the other without producing even the softest creak. She tested the balance of her eating knife, learning to draw it smoothly from its sheath. "You move well," he observed as she completed another soundless circuit of the room. "Have you done this before?" "My father used to take me hunting when I was younger," she replied, slightly breathless from the exertion. "Deer are easily spooked, so we learned to walk without disturbing the forest floor. I never thought such skills would be needed for this." Her voice carried a note of wonder, as if she was discovering capabilities she had never known she possessed. Sten recognized the feeling, the moment when a person realizes they are stronger and more capable than circumstances had allowed them to believe. "Fear has a way of teaching us what we are truly made of," he said quietly. As midnight approached, they made their final preparations. Sten secured his weapons and gear with practiced efficiency, while Thyra carefully wrapped her mother's brooch in a piece of soft cloth and tucked it into an inner pocket of her cloak. The gesture seemed almost ritual, a daughter carrying her mother's blessing into the unknown. Eric presented them with the precious map, its ancient parchment carefully wrapped in oiled leather. "Guard this with your lives," he warned. "Without it, you will wander the mountains until winter claims you." The old warrior also shared one final piece of intelligence that chilled them both. "My grandfather spoke of something else, a reason why the hidden paths were eventually abandoned. He called it the sleepless guardian, something that dwells in the deep places and does not welcome intruders." "What manner of creature?" Sten asked, though he suspected the answer would raise more questions than it resolved. Eric shrugged helplessly. He never said clearly. Perhaps it was only stories meant to discourage the curious. Or perhaps he left the sentence unfinished, but his troubled expression suggested he feared otherwise. As they prepared to depart under cover of darkness, Jarl Ingmar approached for a final word. The older man's weathered features reflected both concern and approval as he clasped Sten's shoulder. "You understand that I cannot acknowledge this mission if it goes ill," he said quietly. "Officially, you have left to pursue a personal matter." "I understand," Sten replied, "and I accept full responsibility for the consequences." The Jarl nodded, then turned to Thyra with surprising gentleness. "You have more courage than some warriors I have known, young woman. May the gods watch over your journey." Thyra's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you for giving us the chance to try." As they slipped from the hall into the star-bright night, Sten felt the familiar weight of purpose settling over him. This was no longer about duty to a Jarl or loyalty to sworn brothers. This was about something more fundamental, the bonds that make us human and the lengths we will go to protect what matters most. Behind them, the warm glow of the mead hall represented safety and belonging. Ahead lay mountain paths that might lead to triumph or doom. But for the first time since finding Thyra weeping in the shadows, Sten felt truly alive. The mountain trail stretched before them like a serpent's back, winding between towering pines whose branches blocked much of the starlight above. Sten and Thyra had been walking in companionable silence for the better part of 2 hours, their footsteps muffled by a carpet of fallen needles that released the sharp scent of evergreen with each step. Eric's map had proven accurate thus far. The hidden path began exactly where the old warrior had indicated, marked by a standing stone carved with symbols so ancient their meaning had been forgotten. The route climbed steadily but not steeply, following natural contours that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. "Rest," Sten murmured, indicating a cluster of boulders that would provide both shelter and concealment. As Thyra settled gratefully onto a moss-covered stone, he studied Eric's precious map by the dim light of the crescent moon. The parchment felt fragile beneath his calloused fingers, its surface marked with faded ink and careful notations in the elder's grandfather's hand. Symbols marked water sources, dangerous passages, and points where the path became treacherous. Most importantly, it showed the network of forgotten routes that could, if they proved passable, bring them within striking distance of the Bloodwolf stronghold while avoiding the heavily patrolled main approaches. "How far have we come?" Thyra asked softly, accepting a drink from his waterskin. "Perhaps a third of the distance to the first major landmark," Sten replied, pointing to a symbol on the map that resembled a broken tooth. Eric called it the Sentry Stone, a natural rock formation that marks where the path begins its true ascent into Bloodwolf territory. Thyra studied the map intently, her quick mind absorbing the details. And from there, 2 more days of climbing through passages that grow increasingly dangerous. If the old routes remain intact, we should reach the approaches to their stronghold by the 3rd evening. He folded the map carefully and returned it to its protective wrapping. Time enough to scout their defenses and find a way inside before the deadline expires. The plan sounded reasonable when spoken aloud, but both of them understood how many assumptions it contained. The paths might be blocked by rockfall or washouts. The stronghold's layout might have changed since Olaf Trader's last visit. The Bloodwolves might have moved their prisoners to a more secure location. Most critically, they were assuming that Bjorn was indeed among the captives, a hope built on circumstantial evidence and desperate need. As they prepared to resume their journey, the sound of approaching voices drifted through the forest behind them. Sten immediately motioned for silence, drawing Thyra deeper into the shadows cast by the boulder cluster. The voices grew clearer as their owners drew near, 2 men speaking in the harsh dialect of the southern settlements. "Told you we should have taken the main road," one complained. "This goat track leads nowhere but deeper into bandit country." "And I told you that Harold Ironarm's patrols watch the main roads," his companion replied irritably. "Unless you want to explain to the Jarl why we were carrying stolen goods through his territory." Sten's jaw tightened at the confirmation of his suspicions. These were not lost travelers, but thieves using the hidden path to avoid justice. Their presence complicated an already dangerous situation. If they were captured or killed, their absence might be noticed. If they were allowed to continue, they might inadvertently alert the Bloodwolves to unusual activity on the old routes. The 2 men passed within arm's reach of their hiding place, their heavy footsteps and careless conversation marking them as amateurs at woodland stealth. They carried crude weapons and moved with the nervous energy of men unaccustomed to honest work. After their voices faded into the distance, Sten and Thyra emerged from concealment. The encounter had shaken them both, the reminder that they were not the only ones using these forgotten paths, and that their mission's secrecy had already been compromised. "Should we follow them?" Thyra whispered. "Ensure they do not interfere with our purpose?" Sten considered the option briefly before shaking his head. "They are moving away from our destination, and dealing with them would cost precious time we cannot spare. We must trust that their own criminal purposes will keep them clear of Bloodwolf territory." As they resumed walking, the forest around them began to change. The friendly pines gave way to more rugged terrain, bare stone outcroppings, stunted trees twisted by mountain winds, and the ever-present scent of snow carried down from the high peaks. The path became more challenging, requiring careful attention to foot placement and frequent consultation of the map. Near dawn, they reached a sheltered overhang where Eric had recommended making their first camp. The location offered protection from both weather and prying eyes, with a clear view of the approaches from below. More importantly, a small spring provided fresh water and the chance to refill their waterskins. As Sten organized their supplies, Thyra explored the immediate area with the careful attention she had learned during her months of searching for Bjorn. Her exploration yielded an unexpected discovery. Carved into the rock face near the spring were symbols similar to those they had seen on Eric's map, but these appeared more recent. "Look at this," she called softly, tracing the marks with her finger. "Someone has been maintaining these old route markers." Sten examined the carvings closely. The symbols were definitely newer than Eric's grandfather's time, perhaps carved within the last few seasons. Someone had been using and updating the hidden paths, which raised troubling questions about who else might know their secrets. Smugglers, perhaps, he suggested, though his tone carried doubt. Or hunters who discovered the routes independently. Or scouts from the Bloodwolf clan, Thyra added quietly, giving voice to his darkest suspicion. The possibility that their enemies already knew about the hidden paths would explain how the Bloodwolves had managed to avoid capture for so long, despite numerous attempts by various Jarls to root them out of their mountain stronghold. If they maintained secret routes for supply and communication, their fortress was far less isolated than it appeared. As they settled down to rest during the daylight hours, Thyra pulled her torn cloak closer around her shoulders. The mountain air carried a chill that promised worse to come as they climbed higher, and their warm clothing, adequate for the lowlands, might prove insufficient for the peaks ahead. "Tell me about him," Sten said gently, recognizing that she needed distraction from cold and worry. "Your brother. What was he like before the raid?" Thyra's expression softened with memory. "Curious about everything. Always asking questions. How do birds find their way home? Why does iron rust? Where do rivers begin?" She smiled, despite their circumstances. "Father said he would make a fine scholar, but Bjorn insisted he wanted to be a blacksmith like his papa." Her words painted a picture of a bright child whose natural intelligence might be serving him well in captivity. Smart children often found ways to make themselves useful, earning better treatment and perhaps even protection from their captors. "He sounds resourceful," Sten observed. "Such children learn quickly how to survive." "I pray you are right," Thyra replied, fingering the wrapped brooch in her cloak. "I pray he has not lost hope." As morning light filtered through the overhanging rock, they settled into an uneasy rest. Tomorrow would bring them deeper into enemy territory and closer to answers that might transform hope into either joy or devastating grief. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky when they finally reached what remained of Thyra's family farmstead. The journey had taken them several miles off their direct route to the Bloodwolf territory, but Sten understood why she needed to make this pilgrimage. Some ghosts could only be laid to rest by facing them directly. The destruction was more complete than he had imagined. Charred timbers lay scattered like broken bones across ground that still bore scorch marks despite 3 months of weather. The stone foundation of the main house remained, but everything built upon it had been reduced to ash and memory. Even the barn, which might have been spared for practical reasons, showed signs of deliberate burning. Thyra stood motionless at the edge of what had once been her family's courtyard, her face a mask of carefully controlled grief. Sten remained a respectful distance behind, understanding that this moment belonged to her alone. The weight of loss hung heavy in the air, as tangible as the lingering scent of smoke that still clung to the blackened stones. "The herb garden," she murmured, moving toward a patch of ground near where the kitchen must have been. Mother was so proud of it. Despite the devastation, signs of Astrid's careful cultivation remained. Hardy perennial herbs had survived the burning and were beginning to show new growth, thyme and sage, pushing through soil enriched by ash. Thyra knelt among the stubborn plants, her fingers gentle as she touched the emerging leaves. She always said that life finds a way to return, even after the worst destruction, Thyra said softly. "I thought it was just something mothers tell their children to comfort them." Sten watched her gather a small bundle of the surviving herbs, understanding their significance. These living remnants of her mother's care would carry more meaning than any treasure. As she carefully wrapped them in a piece of cloth from her pack, he noticed something glinting in the disturbed soil nearby. "There," he said quietly, pointing to the metallic gleam. Something buried there. Thyra followed his gaze and immediately began digging with her hands, heedless of the dirt that accumulated under her fingernails. What emerged from the earth was a small, carved wooden horse, its surface darkened by fire, but still recognizable. The craftsmanship was simple, but loving the work of a father creating a toy for his beloved son. "Bjorn's horse," she whispered, cradling the artifact against her chest. "Father carved it for his 6th birthday. He carried it everywhere, said it was his brave steed that would take him on adventures." Her voice broke slightly. "He must have dropped it when the attack began." The wooden horse represented more than a lost toy. It was proof of Bjorn's presence here, confirmation that her brother had indeed been at the farmstead when the bloodwolves struck. But more importantly, its survival amid such complete destruction felt like a message of hope. If this fragile carved wood could endure fire and weather, perhaps the boy who had cherished it possessed similar resilience. As Thyra examined the toy horse more closely, she discovered something that made her catch her breath in surprise. 3 small holes had been carefully drilled through its neck, and when she raised it to her lips and blew gently, it produced a soft, clear whistle. "He learned to do this from the village shepherd," she explained, her eyes bright with memory. "Old Gunnar taught him that a horse that could sing would never be truly lost." She demonstrated the whistle's clear tone, then looked up at Sten with growing excitement. "Don't you see? If Bjorn still has this skill, he might be able to signal us when we reach the stronghold." Sten nodded thoughtfully. The simple shepherd's trick could indeed prove invaluable for locating a specific child among many captives. The soft whistle would carry farther than a voice, but remain subtle enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention from guards. They spent another hour searching the ruins, gathering anything that might be useful for their mission or meaningful for Thyra's emotional healing. The remains of the smithy yielded a few tools that had survived the flames, while careful exploration of the grain storage revealed a cache of supplies that the raiders had overlooked. Most significantly, they discovered evidence that contradicted the assumption that all the farmstead's inhabitants had been killed or captured. Hidden beneath an overturned feeding trough, they found signs of recent habitation breadcrumbs that could not have survived 3 months of weather, and a small pile of coins carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. "Someone has been living here," Sten observed, studying the concealed shelter. "Someone who knew where to hide." Thyra's pulse quickened as she examined the evidence. Could it be? Might someone from our settlement have escaped? Before Sten could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Someone was indeed using the ruins as shelter, and that someone was returning. They quickly concealed themselves behind the remains of the stone wall, weapons ready but hoping to avoid violence with what might be a fellow survivor. The figure that emerged from the forest was bent with age and moved with the careful steps of someone conserving limited strength. As the stranger drew closer, Thyra gasped in recognition and burst from their hiding place. Uncle Hakon, the elderly man, Thyra's father's brother, who had lived in the hills above the farmstead, looked up in shock that quickly transformed to overwhelming joy. The reunion was tearful and fierce, 2 survivors of a shared tragedy finding comfort in each other's continued existence. "Child, I thought you were dead," Hakon wheezed as Thyra embraced him. "When I came down from my mountain cabin and found this destruction, I searched everywhere for bodies. When I could not find you or young Bjorn, I hoped, but 3 months with no word. I have been searching for him," Thyra explained quickly. "Following every lead, visiting every settlement. Uncle, tell me, did you see anything? Do you know what happened to Bjorn?" Hakon's weathered face grew grave. "I arrived too late to help, but not too late to see the raiders departing. They had captives with them. I could see the children bound in their supply wagons." He gripped Thyra's shoulders with surprising strength. "Your brother was among them, child, alive and unharmed when they took him away." This confirmation energized Thyra beyond measure. Her months of desperate searching had been justified, Bjorn had indeed survived the raid and been taken captive. But Hakon's next words sobered them all. But that was 3 months past, and many captives do not survive long in Bloodwolf hands. They work them hard and feed them little. If the boy still lives, he shook his head sadly. Sten stepped forward, introducing himself and explaining their mission. Hakon listened with growing amazement as he learned of their desperate plan to infiltrate the Bloodwolf stronghold. "You would attempt this rescue with only 2 people?" the old man asked incredulously. "We would attempt it, if necessary, with only 1, Sten replied firmly. "Some duties transcend considerations of odds or safety." Hakon studied the giant warrior with new respect, then turned to examine Eric's precious map when Sten showed it to him. The old man's eyes widened as he recognized landmarks and routes. "These paths, I traveled some of them in my youth when I hunted in the high country, but they have been abandoned for good reason. Rock falls, washouts, places where the mountain itself has shifted." He traced one route with his finger. "This passage here, it led to mining caves that connected to the Bloodwolf territory, but the entrance was sealed by avalanche 20 years past." The information was disheartening but not devastating. Alternate routes existed, though they would be more dangerous and time-consuming. As evening approached, Hakon insisted they share his meager supper and rest in his sheltered corner of the ruins. As they sat around a small fire built in the remains of the farmstead's hearth, Thyra clutched Bjorn's wooden toy horse close to her heart. Tomorrow they would resume their journey into increasingly dangerous territory, but tonight they had gained something precious, absolute certainty that their mission was not in vain. The pre-dawn air carried the metallic taste of approaching snow as Sten and Thyra crested the ridge that marked the boundary of Bloodwolf territory. Below them, the landscape transformed from familiar rolling hills to something far more sinister, jagged peaks that clawed at low-hanging clouds, narrow valleys shrouded in permanent shadow, and paths that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into a maze of stone and ice. Despite Uncle Hakon's warnings about the sealed mining passages, they had been forced to attempt the route when the primary path proved impassable due to recent rockfall. The detour had cost them precious hours, and now they found themselves approaching enemy territory with only 1 full day remaining before the new moon deadline. "There," Sten pointed to a distant spire of rock that rose like a dark finger against the grey sky. "The stronghold." Even at this distance, the Bloodwolf fortress impressed with its brutal efficiency. Built into and around a natural stone pinnacle, it commanded views of every major approach while remaining virtually invisible from the valleys below. No siege engines could reach it. No conventional assault could succeed against walls that merged seamlessly with living rock. Thyra studied the stronghold through the morning mist, her hand unconsciously touching the wooden horse tucked safely in her cloak. "How many people do you think they hold captive there?" "Too many," Sten replied grimly. The fortress was larger than Olaf Trader's descriptions had suggested, with multiple levels carved into the mountainside. If the Bloodwolves had been raiding steadily for months, they might be holding dozens of prisoners in those dark chambers. As they began their careful descent toward the stronghold's outer perimeter, they encountered the first signs of the clan's true nature. Mounted on stakes along what had once been a mountain trail were the severed heads of previous visitors, merchants, messengers, and warriors whose business had displeased their hosts. The grotesque display served as both warning and promise to anyone foolish enough to approach uninvited. But it was the sight beyond the death markers that truly revealed the scope of Bloodwolf cruelty. In a cleared area near the base of the fortress, they could see evidence of recent raids arranged like trophies, household goods, farming tools, and personal belongings taken from destroyed settlements and displayed as symbols of conquest. Among the scattered possessions, one item made Thyra gasp in recognition. Hanging from a wooden post was a torn piece of fabric that matched the pattern of her mother's favorite shawl, the one Astrid had been wearing when the raiders struck their farmstead. "They kept it," she whispered, her voice tight with controlled rage. They kept a piece of my mother's shawl like some kind of prize. The fragment of blood-stained cloth fluttered in the mountain wind like a banner of suffering, and Sten felt his own anger rising at the casual cruelty it represented. These were not warriors fighting for territory or honor, but predators who delighted in causing pain for its own sake. They spent the morning carefully scouting the fortress perimeter, mapping guard positions, and identifying potential entry points. The main gates were heavily defended, with crossbow positions covering every approach. The walls themselves appeared unclimbable, their surface polished smooth by years of wind and rain. But their careful observation revealed something encouraging. The guards were focused almost entirely on external threats. The Bloodwolves clearly believed their fortress to be impregnable, and their vigilance reflected that assumption. They watched for armies and siege engines, not for two desperate people attempting the impossible. As noon approached, they discovered what might be their only opportunity. On the stronghold's eastern face, where the natural rock formation was most treacherous, a series of narrow ledges provided access to what appeared to be ventilation shafts. The route would require climbing skills that bordered on madness, but it offered a path that no sensible attacker would attempt. "The entrance is there," Sten indicated a dark opening barely visible among the stone shadows. "But reaching it will require crossing that cliff face during daylight hours. If we are seen, we will not be seen," Thyra replied, with quiet confidence that surprised him. "I spent my childhood climbing trees to gather honey from wild hives. Stone is no more treacherous than wet bark 30 feet above the ground." Her determination impressed him, but Sten remained concerned about the physical demands of the climb. The cliff face was exposed to mountain winds that could easily dislodge an unwary climber, and the rock itself appeared to be loose shale that might crumble under pressure. Their reconnaissance was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices, a patrol of Bloodwolf warriors returning from some mission in the lower valleys. Sten and Thyra pressed themselves against a boulder cluster, hardly daring to breathe as the armed men passed within yards of their hiding place. The patrol consisted of 4 fighters wearing crude armor, decorated with wolf pelts and bone ornaments. Their weapons showed recent use, and dark stains on their clothing suggested their recent activities had been anything but peaceful. Most disturbing was their casual conversation about the captives they held. "The children grow more troublesome," one complained. "Yesterday, 3 of them attempted to tunnel through their cell wall. Beat them harder," another suggested with casual cruelty. "Children learn obedience quickly when properly motivated. Cannot damage them too severely," a third voice cautioned. "The chieftain has plans for the lot of them, something about sending a message to Magnus when the deadline arrives." Sten felt Thyra tense beside him at these words, and he placed a restraining hand on her arm to prevent any rash action. They needed to hear what information the patrol might reveal. "What manner of message?" the first voice asked. "The kind delivered with blood and screaming," came the harsh reply. "Magnus will understand that defying us carries a price measured in innocent lives." As the patrol disappeared into the distance, Thyra emerged from hiding with murder in her eyes. "Did you hear what they plan? They intend to kill the children as an example." "I heard," Sten replied grimly. "Which means we cannot wait for darkness to make our attempt. We must reach Bjorn and the others before tomorrow's deadline." The urgency of their mission had just increased exponentially. What had been a desperate rescue attempt was now a race to prevent mass murder. They spent the afternoon in final preparation, studying the cliff face approach until they had memorized every handhold and ledge. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the mountainside, they made their final approach to the base of the treacherous eastern wall. The climb ahead would test every ounce of skill and courage they possessed, and failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the slaughter of innocent children. Thyra touched her mother's brooch one final time, then tucked it securely away. "For Bjorn," she whispered, beginning the ascent. "For all of them," Sten agreed, following her up the deadly stone face toward whatever awaited them in the darkness above. Below them, the display of raided goods fluttered in the wind, including that fragment of Astrid's shawl that had become a symbol of everything they fought against. Tomorrow, one way or another, that symbol would be answered. The ventilation shaft proved larger than it had appeared from below, carved from living rock with tool marks that suggested recent maintenance. As Sten and Thyra crawled through the narrow passage, their breathing echoed softly in the confined space, mixing with distant sounds that drifted up from the fortress depths, the clank of chains, muffled voices, and somewhere far below, the unmistakable sound of children's voices raised in what might have been song. The shaft gradually widened into a natural cave system that honeycombed the mountain's interior. Ancient water flow had carved chambers and tunnels throughout the rock, creating a hidden network that the bloodwolves had discovered and adapted for their own purposes. Oil lamps mounted at irregular intervals provided enough light to navigate, while casting dancing shadows that made every corner seem alive with movement. Following the sound of children's voices, they descended through a series of connected chambers until they reached a vantage point overlooking the fortress's lower levels. What they saw below transformed their understanding of everything they had assumed about their mission. The space was not a traditional prison, but rather a vast underground workshop where dozens of children labored at various tasks under minimal supervision. Some worked bellows at small forges, others sorted metal scraps or operated simple tools. The scene suggested not casual captivity, but organized exploitation. The children were being used as skilled labor rather than merely held for ransom or spite. But it was the sound that had guided them here that proved most shocking. The children were indeed singing, but not the desperate songs of the hopeless. Their voices carried clear and strong in a complex harmony that spoke of organization, purpose, and most surprisingly, hope. Someone was leading this chorus, someone who understood music and morale. "There," Thyra breathed, pointing to a slight figure near one of the forges who was directing the others with subtle hand gestures. "Bjorn." Sten studied the boy, she indicated, noting the confident way he moved among the other children and how they looked to him for guidance. This was not the broken victim they had expected to rescue, but a leader who had somehow maintained not just his own spirit, but inspired others as well. As they watched, Bjorn approached a group of younger children who were struggling with a sorting task. Instead of simply helping them, he began teaching them a more efficient method, his patient instruction revealing both intelligence and natural leadership. Most remarkably, he accomplished all of this while maintaining the pretense of normal work. Any casual observer would see only children performing assigned labor. "He has organized them," Sten realized with growing amazement. "Look how they move, how they communicate without speaking. This is not random activity, but coordinated preparation." Indeed, closer observation revealed that the children's seemingly mundane tasks were actually serving a hidden purpose. The metal sorting was separating useful materials from scrap. The bellows work was maintaining small forges that could serve purposes beyond their current assignments. Most tellingly, several of the older children were crafting what appeared to be simple tools, but with modifications that suggested other uses. The revelation struck them both simultaneously. They had not come to rescue a helpless victim, but to join an escape attempt that was already in motion. As if responding to their thoughts, Bjorn suddenly raised his hand in a subtle signal that caused all the children to shift their attention toward a particular corner of the chamber. There, partially concealed behind stacked supplies, Sten glimpsed what appeared to be the entrance to another tunnel system, one that had been carefully cleared of debris and prepared for use. A soft whistle drifted through the chamber, barely audible above the general noise, but clearly meaningful to the children. Bjorn responded with an answering whistle of his own, a complex sequence of notes that seemed to convey specific information. When Thyra heard those familiar tones, tears sprang to her eyes. "The horse song," she whispered. Father taught him to whistle like that using his wooden horse, he still remembers. But the whistling sequence contained more than nostalgic melody. As Bjorn repeated the pattern with slight variations, it became clear that he was communicating with someone else, someone who was not visible in the main chamber, but who was responding from elsewhere in the tunnel system. He is not just organizing the children in this room, Sten observed with growing respect. He has established contact with other captives throughout the complex. This boy has created an entire resistance network. Their assumption that they were conducting a simple rescue mission crumbled as they witnessed the scope of Bjorn's achievements. The 9-year-old had not merely survived 3 months of captivity, he had become the leader of what appeared to be a comprehensive escape plan involving multiple groups of prisoners. A carved bone whistle, tiny and cunningly crafted, emerged from Bjorn's hidden pocket as he prepared to send another signal. The instrument was clearly his own work, carved with the skill his father had begun teaching him before the raid. But this was no simple toy. It was a sophisticated communication device designed to carry coded messages through the fortress's stone chambers. As they watched in fascination, Bjorn's signal was answered by similar whistles from different directions, creating a brief musical conversation that somehow avoided detection by the few guards visible in the chamber. The children continued their work throughout this exchange, their practiced normalcy suggesting they had been developing these systems for weeks. "How many are involved?" Thyra wondered aloud as the whistled communication concluded. Their answer came as Bjorn began moving through the chamber with apparent casualness, stopping to inspect various workstations while actually delivering what were clearly final instructions. At each stop, he received subtle confirmations, a nod here, a hand gesture there that indicated widespread readiness for coordinated action. The scale of the operation became clear as children throughout the chamber began making small, seemingly innocent adjustments to their positions and equipment. Tools were moved within easier reach. Passages were quietly cleared of obstruction. Most tellingly, the older children began positioning themselves near the younger ones in protective formations that could transition quickly from work groups to escape teams. Sten found himself reassessing not just their rescue mission, but his understanding of courage itself. While he had been planning to save one helpless child, that child had been organizing the liberation of dozens. While he had been assuming that size and strength were prerequisites for heroism, a 9-year-old had been proving that leadership and determination mattered more than physical power. "We are not here to rescue him," he told Thyra quietly. "We are here to join his escape." The realization transformed their approach entirely. Instead of infiltrating the fortress to extract one boy, they were now positioned to support a mass breakout that had been planned from within. Their military experience and adult capabilities would be invaluable assets to Bjorn's network, but they were no longer the leaders of this mission. They were reinforcements, arriving at exactly the right moment. As if sensing their presence, Bjorn suddenly looked up toward their hiding place with uncanny accuracy. For a moment, brother and sister's eyes met across the chamber, and Sten witnessed a reunion that transcended the need for words or embraces. In that single look, Thyra saw that her brother had not merely survived, but had grown into someone she could be proud of. In return, Bjorn saw that his faith in eventual rescue had been justified. His sister had never stopped searching for him. The boy's next whistle sequence was different from the others, longer, more complex, and clearly directed toward their position. When Thyra responded with a soft whistle of her own, using the horse song melody their father had taught them both, the effect on the chamber was immediate. The children's carefully maintained facade of normal work dissolved into barely suppressed excitement as word spread that the escape was about to begin. But as Bjorn raised his hand to signal the start of their coordinated breakout, a new sound echoed through the fortress, the harsh blast of a war horn that meant only one thing. Their presence had been discovered, and the bloodwolves were mobilizing to respond. The gentle whistling songs were about to be replaced by the sound of battle, and the success of dozens of young lives now depended on how well 3 months of secret planning could adapt to sudden crisis. The boy who had carved hope from despair was about to discover whether his impossible dream could survive the harsh reality of armed resistance. The time for hiding and preparation had ended. The time for action had arrived, and it would demand everything that courage could provide. The war horn's blast still echoed through the stone corridors when Bjorn's whistle cut through the chaos with a sharp, urgent sequence that transformed the chamber below into coordinated motion. Children who had been working at forges suddenly produced real weapons: knives crafted from scrap metal, clubs reinforced with iron bands, and slings made from leather strips. What had appeared to be simple labor tools revealed themselves as carefully prepared instruments of rebellion. Sten watched in amazement as the boys' months of planning unfolded with military precision. The youngest children moved toward the concealed tunnel entrance, while older ones formed protective screens around them. Those who had been working the bellows used their tools to scatter burning coals across potential choke points, creating barriers that would slow pursuing guards. Every movement served multiple purposes. Every action supported the greater plan. "We must get down there," Thyra whispered urgently, but Sten caught her arm before she could move. "Wait," he commanded softly, studying the chamber's layout with tactical eyes. "Look how they move. Each group has specific assignments and predetermined routes. If we interfere randomly, we will disrupt systems that took months to develop." Indeed, Bjorn's organization was far more sophisticated than they had initially realized. The children operated in cells of 4 or 5, each group responsible for particular objectives while maintaining communication with the whole. One team focused on securing escape routes, another on gathering essential supplies, while a third worked to neutralize guard positions through coordinated distraction and ambush. The carved bone whistle appeared in Bjorn's hand again, and he produced a complex signal that seemed to coordinate final preparations. Almost immediately, answering whistles echoed from distant parts of the fortress, confirmation that other groups of captives throughout the complex were ready to move. "How many children are involved in this?" Sten asked in wonder. Before Thyra could speculate, their question was answered as figures began emerging from concealed positions throughout the chamber. Children who had seemed to be working alone revealed themselves to be part of larger groups. Hidden passages that had appeared empty disgorged additional escapees. In moments, what had looked like a workshop staffed by perhaps 20 captives transformed into a gathering of nearly 50 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15. But it was the figure who emerged from the largest concealed passage that truly shocked them both. An elderly man, bent with age but moving with quiet authority, appeared at Bjorn's side. His presence explained much about the sophistication of the escape plan. An adult advisor who could provide experience to supplement the boy's natural leadership. "Old Henrik," Thyra breathed in recognition. "The village elder from Greywater. I thought he had been killed in the raid." Henrik the Wise had been captured rather than killed, and his presence transformed their understanding of the resistance network's capabilities. The old man had clearly been teaching the children not just escape tactics, but organizational principles that would serve them well beyond their immediate crisis. As the war horn sounded again, Henrik moved to Bjorn's side and spoke rapidly in his ear. The boy nodded, then raised his whistle one final time. The signal he produced was different from all the others, longer, more complex, and clearly a final command sequence. The effect was immediate and breathtaking. Children throughout the chamber began moving with practiced efficiency toward predetermined positions. But these were not random flight patterns. They were executing what appeared to be a comprehensive battle plan designed to neutralize the fortress's defenses while facilitating mass evacuation. Sten realized with growing admiration that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A 9-year-old boy and an elderly scholar had created an escape network that rivaled military operations he had seen planned by experienced commanders. The children were not just fleeing, they were conquering their captors through superior preparation and coordination. The sound of approaching footsteps and shouted commands indicated that Bloodwolf guards were responding to the alarm, but their voices carried confusion rather than confidence. Clearly, they had never faced coordinated resistance from their prisoners and were uncertain how to respond to organized opposition. "Now we act," Sten decided, drawing his sea axe and preparing to descend into the chamber. But Thyra caught his arm with surprising strength. "No," she said firmly. "Look at what they have accomplished without us. Our role is not to take command, but to support their plan. We must discover how we can best serve their escape, not impose our own ideas upon their success." Her wisdom impressed him. The natural instinct of a warrior was to seize control and direct action according to his own experience. But these children had proven their capability beyond question, and interference might do more harm than good. As they debated their best approach, Bjorn himself resolved the question. The boy looked up toward their hiding place and produced a specific whistle sequence, clearly a direct communication attempt. When Thyra responded with her own careful notes, Bjorn smiled and gestured for them to descend. The reunion between brother and sister was brief but profound. Bjorn had grown in the months since the raid, not just physically, but in presence and authority. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced the worst and discovered his own strength in response. "Sister," he said simply, his voice carrying none of the terror they had expected. "You came as Henrik said you would. You knew I would search for you?" Thyra asked, tears threatening to overwhelm her composure. Henrik said, "Family bonds are stronger than stone walls or iron bars. He told me that if I survived long enough and planned well enough, you would find a way to help." Bjorn's smile carried wisdom beyond his years. "I have been preparing for this day since the first week of captivity." Henrik approached with the careful steps of age, but his eyes remained sharp with intelligence and determination. "Young Bjorn has been a remarkable student," he said quietly. But he learned quickly that escape required not just courage but coordination. One child alone could not succeed, but 50 children working together, that was a different matter entirely. The old scholar's words confirmed what Sten had begun to suspect. This was not a desperate flight born of recent opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been developing since the earliest days of captivity. Every tool that had been made, every passage that had been cleared, every signal system that had been developed, all had been building toward this moment. "What do you need from us?" Sten asked, recognizing that his role was to support rather than command. "The guards will try to seal the main escape routes once they understand what is happening," Bjorn explained with tactical clarity that impressed the veteran warrior. "We need someone to secure our primary exit while we complete the evacuation of the deeper cells." He gestured toward a passage that led upward, presumably toward the fortress's exterior walls. "Can you hold that corridor long enough for all the children to pass through?" Sten examined the indicated route with professional eyes. It was a natural choke point where a small number of defenders could hold off larger forces, at least temporarily. The stone walls would prevent flanking maneuvers while providing cover from missile weapons. Most importantly, it was positioned to protect the escape route without requiring him to abandon the children to face the main Bloodwolf force alone. "How long do you need?" he asked. "Henrik estimates another quarter-hour to clear the remaining cells and gather essential supplies," Bjorn replied. "Can you give us that much time?" A quarter-hour was a lifetime in combat, especially when facing unknown numbers of enemy fighters in their own stronghold. But as Sten looked around at the determined faces of children who had refused to surrender hope, he found his answer easily. "You will have your quarter-hour," he promised, "and more if needed." As if summoned by his words, the sound of heavy footsteps and harsh voices began echoing from multiple directions. The Bloodwolves were mobilizing in force, and the time for preparation had ended. Sten drew his great axe, the one he had decided to bring despite earlier plans for stealth, and felt its familiar weight settle into his hands. Beside him, Thyra produced the eating knife she had practiced with, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. They were pitifully armed compared to what was coming, but they were fighting for something that made weapons secondary. From his cloak, Sten withdrew the iron arm ring that had belonged to his father, a simple band of metal worn smooth by generations of honest work. It had been passed down through his family as a symbol of legacy and continuity, and now he pressed it into Thyra's palm. "For protection," he said simply, though they both understood it meant far more. The arm ring represented the bonds that endure beyond death, the connections that give meaning to sacrifice, and the promise that some things are worth any price to preserve. As Thyra closed her fingers around the ancient metal, she felt the weight of all the fathers who had worn it and all the children they had protected. Behind them, Bjorn's whistle gave the final signal, and the great escape began in earnest. 50 voices rose in the song they had been practicing, not a cry of despair, but an anthem of liberation, sung by those who had discovered that courage could overcome any obstacle. The battle for their freedom was about to begin, and it would be fought not just with weapons, but with the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to be conquered. The first blood-wolf warrior to round the corner into Sten's defended corridor died before he could raise an alarm, the giant's axe taking him cleanly at the neck. But his death cry echoed through the stone passages, and within moments the sound of running feet announced the arrival of his comrades. Sten positioned himself at the narrowest point of the passage, where the ancient stone walls created a bottleneck that would force his enemies to face him one or two at a time. Behind him, he could hear the organized chaos of the children's evacuation, Henrik's calm voice directing traffic, while Bjorn's whistle provided coordination signals for the various escape groups. The second wave of attackers approached more cautiously, having learned from their comrades' fate. 3 warriors advanced with shields raised and weapons ready, their wolf pelt armor and bone ornaments marking them as veterans of many raids. But they had spent years fighting farmers and merchants. They were unprepared for a defender who had trained his entire life for exactly this kind of combat. Sten's fighting style had evolved over the decades, from the wild aggression of youth to something far more efficient and deadly. He moved with economical precision, each swing of his axe serving multiple purposes, killing one opponent while positioning for the next strike, clearing space while maintaining defensive position. Most importantly, he fought not for glory or conquest but for time, and every second he gained was a victory in itself. The corridor, filled with the harsh music of combat steel on steel, the thud of weapons against shields, and the grunt of warriors testing their strength against each other. But underneath these sounds, Sten could hear something that gave his efforts meaning, the voices of children singing as they moved through the escape routes, their anthem of liberation growing stronger rather than weaker as the battle intensified. Thyra positioned herself behind him with her small knife ready, watching for any opponent who might slip past his guard, while also serving as his eyes and ears for what was happening in the chamber behind them. Her presence steadied him more than he had expected, not because he needed protection, but because fighting to defend someone specific made every movement more purposeful. 4th group is through, she reported, as another wave of small voices moved past them toward freedom. Henrik says perhaps 10 more minutes. 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours given the intensity of the combat. Already more warriors were arriving to reinforce the attack, and Sten could hear orders being shouted in the harsh bloodwolf dialect. They were organizing for a coordinated assault that would test his ability to hold the choke point. But as the pressure mounted, something unexpected happened. From deeper in the fortress came sounds of combat from other directions, clashing steel and shouted commands that suggested the children's escape was proceeding on multiple fronts. Bjorn's plan had not focused all resistance in this single corridor, but had created diversions and conflicts throughout the stronghold. "The boy is brilliant," Sten muttered as he parried a spear thrust and delivered a counterattack that sent his opponent staggering backward. He is not just evacuating, he is forcing them to fight on too many fronts at once. Indeed, the sounds indicated that the Bloodwolves were facing coordinated resistance throughout their fortress. Children who had spent months observing guard routines and mapping patrol routes were now using that knowledge to strike at weak points while avoiding concentrations of enemy strength. What should have been a simple matter of recapturing escaped prisoners had become a complex military engagement against opponents who knew the terrain better than their captors. A new voice joined the shouted commands, deeper, more authoritative, carrying the unmistakable tone of absolute command. The Bloodwolf chieftain had arrived to take personal control of the situation, and his presence would transform the nature of the combat. "Bring fire," the voice commanded. "Smoke them out if steel cannot reach them." The threat of fire in the stone passages created a new urgency. While the children might escape through routes that warriors could not pursue, flames would follow any path that air could travel. The evacuation had to be completed before the Bloodwolves could implement this new tactic. "How many more?" Sten asked as he drove back another assault. "3 groups left," Thyra replied, then added with wonder in her voice, "But Bjorn is not with any of them. He is staying until the very end." Of course he was. The boy who had organized this impossible escape would not abandon his post until every other child was safely away. It was exactly what Sten would have done in his position, exactly what any true leader would do when faced with the choice between personal safety and duty to others. The attacks intensified as more warriors arrived, but they also became less coordinated as the sounds of combat from other parts of the fortress demanded the chieftain's attention. The children's diversionary tactics were succeeding, forcing their enemies to divide their forces just when concentrated power was most needed. From behind him came the sound he had been waiting for, Bjorn's whistle, giving the signal that meant the evacuation was nearly complete. But mixed with that welcome news came a more ominous sound, the crackle of flames and the acrid smell of burning oil that announced the implementation of the chieftain's fire strategy. The easy part of their escape was over. Now came the test that would determine whether months of planning could overcome the brutal realities of smoke, flame, and the desperate fury of enemies who had been humiliated by children. Smoke began filling the corridor as the Bloodwolves implemented their fire strategy, forcing Sten to fight while struggling for each breath. But the flames that were meant to drive them out also worked against their attackers. The narrow passage became a furnace that cooked men in their armor and made coordinated assault nearly impossible. Through the thickening smoke came Bjorn himself, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every stone of these passages. In his hands were the broken shackles that had once bound his wrists, iron chains that he had somehow managed to snap during the early moments of the escape. The sight of those severed links struck Sten as profoundly symbolic physical proof that the boy's spirit had never truly been captured. "The last group is through," Bjorn reported, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "But the chieftain has blocked our primary escape route with burning oil. We need another way out." Behind them, Henrik appeared through the smoke like an ancient sage emerging from legend. The old scholar carried a crude map sketched on what appeared to be scraped leather intelligence gathered during months of careful observation. "There is another path," Henrik announced, studying his makeshift chart. "The old mining tunnels connect to a natural cave system that emerges below the fortress, but it requires passing through the chieftain's personal chambers. The route would take them directly past the most dangerous enemy in the stronghold, but it offered their only hope of avoiding the flames that were rapidly making their current position untenable." Sten made the decision with the quick certainty of a veteran warrior. "Lead the way," he commanded. "I will provide rear guard action." As they began their fighting withdrawal through passages increasingly filled with smoke and flame, the sounds of pursuit followed relentlessly. But now there was a difference. The random chaos of the early fighting had been replaced by the coordinated fury of the Bloodwolf chieftain leading his warriors personally. The chieftain's presence transformed everything. Where before the pursuit had been hampered by confusion and divided attention, now it moved with single-minded purpose. His voice cut through the smoke and noise, directing his warriors with tactical skill that matched anything Sten had encountered on conventional battlefields. They emerged from the burning passages into a larger chamber that had clearly served as the chieftain's private quarters. Weapons lined the walls alongside trophies taken from defeated enemies, shields bearing the devices of murdered jarls, silver arm rings stripped from dead warriors, and most disturbing of all, children's toys arranged like hunting prizes. Here, finally, Sten came face to face with the man who had ordered such systematic cruelty. The Bloodwolf chieftain was younger than expected, perhaps 40 winters, with the lean build of someone who fought for pleasure rather than necessity. His armor bore decorations made from human bones, and his skull helm was crowned with the preserved scalps of enemies. "So," the chieftain said conversationally as his warriors filled the chamber behind him, "the famous Sten Bearshoulder comes to play rescuer to a handful of slaves. How disappointing that your reputation was built on such modest ambitions." Sten hefted his axe, feeling its familiar weight settle into his hands. Around him, Thyra and Bjorn moved to defensive positions, while Henrik clutched his map with trembling but determined fingers. They were outnumbered 5-1 in an enemy stronghold, with fire cutting off their retreat, but somehow Sten felt more hopeful than he had in years. "I have learned," he replied quietly, "that the most important battles are fought for the smallest reasons." The chieftain's laughter was genuinely amused. "Philosophy from a hired killer? How wonderfully unexpected, but philosophy will not save you or these pathetic children you have come so far to die for." As if summoned by his words, the sound of Bjorn's broken chains rattled softly as the boy moved. The noise was barely audible above the general chaos, but it carried meaning that went beyond mere sound. Those severed links represented the breaking of more than physical bonds. They symbolized the triumph of spirit over oppression, of hope over despair. "Perhaps not," Sten admitted, "but some things are worth dying for, and some victories are measured in more than survival." The final battle began not with grand speeches or ceremonial challenges, but with the practical necessities of violence. The chieftain was skilled, his warriors were experienced, and their position seemed hopeless. But as steel met steel in the flickering light of the burning fortress, something unexpected happened. From throughout the stronghold came the sound of children's voices raised in song, not the desperate cries of victims, but the triumphant chorus of those who had seized their own freedom. Every child who had escaped was now beyond the reach of Bloodwolf cruelty, and their voices carried through stone and flame to remind everyone present what this battle was truly about. The broken shackles in Bjorn's hands caught the firelight as he moved, their fractured metal gleaming like symbols of liberation itself. The boy who had refused to surrender hope was about to discover whether courage alone could overcome the darkest cruelty, and whether the bonds of family were stronger than the chains of oppression. In moments, they would learn if freedom was something that could be taken, or if it was something that lived within the human heart and could never truly be destroyed. The final confrontation lasted less time than the songs of freedom that echoed through the mountain passages around them. When it ended, the Bloodwolf chieftain lay defeated not through death, for Sten had chosen mercy over vengeance, but through the complete destruction of everything he had built his power upon. His warriors scattered, his stronghold burned, and his reputation shattered by the knowledge that children had outsmarted him. Most significantly, he lived to face the consequences of his cruelty when the other Jarls learned how easily his impregnable fortress had fallen to the coordinated action of those he had dismissed as helpless victims. Sometimes, Sten reflected as they made their escape through Henrik's alternative route, humiliation was a more fitting punishment than death. 3 weeks later, the mead hall of Jarl Ingmar resonated with voices that had not been heard there before, the laughter and chatter of nearly 50 children who had found new homes among the various settlements of the region. Some had been reunited with surviving family members, others had been adopted by families who had lost their own children to raids, and a few had chosen to remain in Ingmar's hall as wards under the Jarl's protection. Sten sat at his familiar place at the high table, but everything about the scene had changed. Beside him, Thyra wore a new dress of fine blue wool, not borrowed this time, but crafted specifically for her by the grateful mothers of rescued children. Her torn cloak from that first night had been carefully mended, and now hung in a place of honor near the hearth, transformed from a symbol of loss into a reminder of hope recovered. Bjorn had grown in the weeks since their escape, not just in height, but in presence. He moved through the hall with quiet authority, checking on the younger children and helping Henrik organize lessons for those who needed education in reading and numbers. The broken shackles from his captivity had been melted down by the hall's smith and reforged into a simple iron bracelet that he wore as a reminder not of imprisonment, but of liberation earned through courage and determination. Near the great hearth, a new hearthstone had been installed with ceremony befitting its significance. The stone had come from the ruins of Thyra's family farmstead, carried here at her request to serve as the foundation for what she called the new family fire. It represented the truth they had all learned, that family was not just about blood ties, but about the bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual protection. Henrik the Wise had accepted Jarl Ingmar's invitation to serve as scholar and advisor to the hall, his experience with organizing resistance proving invaluable for training the region's defenses against future threats. But his most important role was as teacher to the rescued children, helping them process their experiences while developing the skills they would need to build productive lives. "Tell us the story again," called out young Astrid, one of the 6-year-olds who had been among the first to escape through Bjorn's tunnels. She had been named for Thyra's mother in a ceremony that had moved everyone present to tears. Sten smiled at the request. Over the past weeks, the tale of their unlikely mission had grown in the telling, but he was careful to keep the focus on the courage of the children rather than the actions of the adults involved. Tonight, however, he decided to tell a different story. "Once," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall, "there was a giant warrior who thought he understood what strength meant. He had won many battles and earned great respect, but he had forgotten something important about where true power comes from." Thyra looked up from where she was braiding young Astrid's hair, recognizing the shift in his usual narrative. Around the hall, conversations quieted as people settled in to listen. This warrior was proud of his great axe and his skill in battle, but he was lonely in ways he did not fully understand. Until one night, he heard someone weeping in the shadows, someone who had lost everything but had not lost hope. That person reminded him that the strongest warriors are not those who defeat the most enemies, but those who protect the most innocent. Bjorn approached the high table, carrying his wooden horse. The toy had been restored and refinished, but it still bore the scorch marks from the farmstead fire. The boy had refused all suggestions to repair those marks, saying they were part of the horse's story now. "The warrior learned," Sten continued, "that real courage is not about fighting for glory or conquest, but about fighting for family, both the family you are born into and the family you choose to create." He discovered that sometimes the most important victories are won not by kings or jarls, but by children who refuse to surrender their hope. As he spoke, Sten's gaze moved around the hall, taking in all the faces that had not been there a month ago. Each represented a life that had been saved not just from physical captivity, but from the deeper prison of believing that they were alone and helpless in the world. "And what did the warrior learn was the secret of true strength?" young Astrid asked, playing her part in the familiar call and response that had developed around their evening stories. "That strength is not about the size of your muscles or the sharpness of your sword," Sten replied, his voice warm with conviction. "It is about the size of your heart and the people you choose to protect with it." From across the hall, Jarl Ingmar raised his horn in a silent toast, not to the rescue mission or the military victory, but to the family that had been forged in fire and emerged stronger for the experience. As the evening continued with songs and stories, Thyra fingered the iron arm ring that Sten had given her during their desperate flight. She had tried to return it once they reached safety, but he had insisted she keep it as a reminder that the bonds of chosen family were just as strong as those of blood. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the winter that would test all their preparations and resolve. But inside the hall, warmth prevailed, not just the warmth of fire and food, but the deeper warmth that comes from knowing you belong somewhere and that someone will notice if you disappear. The new family hearthstone glowed with steady light, its surface warming generations yet to come. Upon it rested Bjorn's wooden horse, no longer a toy but a symbol, proof that hope, like family, could survive any fire and emerge stronger for having been tested. Some stories, Sten reflected as he watched the children settle into sleep around the great fire, have endings that are really beginnings. Tonight was such an ending, and tomorrow would bring the first day of whatever came next for their unlikely but unbreakable family.